All right, aloha everybody. Welcome to Maui's Energy Landscape. This is another one of our series of online educational webinars about Maui's energy future as part of the Upcountry Energy Resilience Project. We have Eric here today with us from the Hawaii State Energy Office, and he's going to present about Maui's energy landscape. So I will go ahead and pass it off to Eric, and feel free to use the chat for questions.
All right, aloha everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction, Stacy, and thank you so much to Stacy and Shay for hosting this. I'm really excited to be here today and to be talking to all of you about Maui's energy landscape. So my name is Eric Sippert, and I'm an Energy Partnerships Program Manager at the Hawaii State Energy Office, and I primarily work on our Energy Transition Initiative Partnership Project. I know that's a mouthful. I'll talk more about what that is in a few slides. And I'm part of our Jobs and Outreach branch. So we do all of the state energy offices, workforce development, as well as community engagement work. And we're always looking to reach out and make more connections with different communities and organizations. So please always feel free to reach out. And I'll end this presentation with my email address, and then I also recommend checking out our website, energy.hawaii.gov, where you can learn more about the work that we do. So today I'm going to cover who exactly we are at the Hawaii State Energy Office, as well as what the Energy Technology Innovation Partnership Project is, which is kind of the impetus for my work with the Upcountry Energy Resilience Project. I'm also going to be talking about Hawaii and renewable energy briefly, just to give some background for Maui's energy system, and then the history of electricity on Maui, a little bit of electric grid 101, who owns the grid and the energy that is produced on Maui, new projects that are currently being developed on Maui or are planned for the future. Those would be the projected needs, and then talk more specifically about Upcountry's challenges and opportunities. I'm going to build in several Q&A sections throughout this presentation. So please feel free to throw questions in the chat, and looking forward to a great discussion and happy to answer any questions. And I should also say at the beginning that although this is titled Maui's Energy Landscape, I'm going to be focused on the electricity grid pretty much exclusively. So I won't be talking about things like transportation or stuff like that. So who is the Hawaii State Energy Office? So we're an agency of the state of Hawaii, and our purpose is to promote energy efficiency, renewable energy, and clean transportation to help achieve a resilient clean energy economy. So this is like what the law actually says. This is our mandate, what we do. And this is just an abbreviated part of that law. But I think a couple of things that are worth pointing out is that we provide analysis and planning, as well as project deployment facilitation. So traditionally, that meant working with all different kinds of energy stakeholders to develop energy projects. But somewhat recently, in the past few years or so, we've been working much more closely with communities. I think there's a broad recognition across the state that without community input, without community guidance and direction, we're not going to reach our renewable energy goals. And I'm really happy to be part of a office and a branch that really prioritizes working with communities. So it's really great to be here with all of you today. As I mentioned, I also work on this Energy Technology Innovation Partnership Project. And that's the project through which I'm working closely with Stacy and Shay and others of the Upcountry Energy Resiliency Project. And that's really bringing, on the one hand, communities, and on the other hand, national lab tech teams together to work on energy resiliency projects. And then HSEO, the Hawaii State Energy Office, serves as the regional partner for that. And really, makes sure all of that works well together and offers input on local specifics and local context. So just to give you an idea of where else there are ETIPP projects, this is the first three cohorts. So ETIPP is focused on rural, islanded, coastal communities. So you can see it's based mostly around coastal areas of the US, including quite a few projects in Hawaii. And then you have this year's cohort, which you can see Upcountry Maui here. Also, Kikinui Homestead on Maui has a project as well. And then we're also working with Waianae here on Oahu. So a little bit of context on Hawaii's energy goals. So as many of you know, we have a renewable portfolio standard, which says that by 2045, we have to have 100% renewable energy. And this is a binding commitment and a mandate that we really have to reach this goal by then. We also have our zero emissions clean economy target, which is focused on the emission side of that. And then we have the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, working together with HSEO on that. So this is just kind of background information that is useful to know. And I'm going to be sharing these slides with Stacy after this to distribute to anyone here who's interested. And I'll make sure that all these hyperlinks work as well. So you can dig into any of this further, or feel free to reach out to me with any clarifying questions. Okay. So that was a lot of background info, and I think there's already a lot of different agencies and groups, and it's important to know like who these really important players are in the energy sector. So we're the energy office. I talked a little bit about what our role is. The other probably really big player is the Public Utilities Commission. So they approve or they regulate our utilities, Hawaiian Electric, and on Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, and they're approving things like rates, contracts between Hawaiian Electric and independent power producers, which I'll talk more about. And I think one analogy that I've been using lately is like the Hawaii State Energy Office where I work is kind of like the coach. We talk to all of the different players, try to get them to work well together and work together towards that clean energy future and 100% renewable energy by 2045. The PUC, on the other hand, is like the referee. So they're making sure that all the rules are followed and that everyone's playing fairly. And that means they can't talk to all of the players as much. They have to be impartial. They're almost like a judge. And there was actually a presentation by the Public Utilities Commission to this group a month or so ago. And if you didn't see that presentation, highly recommend checking it out. So the consumer advocate works very closely with the Public Utilities Commission, and their job is to really advocate for the consumer. So they're really working to make sure that everything that the utility does is keeping prices as low as possible. And they're involved very closely with the PUC. They're almost partner agencies. And then the utility, Hawaiian Electric. So we'll be talking about them a lot in this presentation. They are an investor-owned utility, and by law, they are required to provide power and are guaranteed a profit. But even so, as a monopoly utility, they are regulated by the PUC very closely. I also included Hawaii Energy, which many people get confused with Hawaiian Electric, but Hawaii Energy works on energy efficiency. So as part of Hawaii's state goals around renewable energy, that involves energy efficiency as well. And Hawaii Energy is actually works closely with the Public Utilities Commission and Hawaiian Electric to implement energy efficiency measures. Then we have developers and independent power producers. So I'll talk more about this in a few slides. But Hawaiian Electric actually doesn't own the vast majority of new power plants that are being built. Those are owned by third-party companies who then sell that power to Hawaiian Electric. So they're very important players in the energy landscape as well. And then finally, we have communities, one of the most important players and becoming more important every day. This is where projects are hosted. These are the people who are consuming that energy. And more they're involved in energy making decisions. And more we're seeing community energy planning initiatives, where in the past, most energy planning happened at a very high level. And it was something that the utility did, and then maybe didn't even bother to tell communities what was going on. It just happened. Now more and more communities are involved in those processes. Yeah. All right, so I know that was a lot, and I wanted to pause here if there's any questions on that introductory background information before moving on.
I had a quick question of just about the mandate of renewable energy, 100% renewables. You said it's binding. What about that mandate? Like, what happens if it's not met? Like, what is binding about it?
Yeah, so it's binding in that Hawaiian Electric actually has to submit reports annually on their progress towards those goals. And let's see if I can get back to that slide. So there's these interim targets, like 40% by 2030, 70 by 2040. And if they don't meet those goals, there's actually penalties. So that's what it means by binding.
I also had a question, Eric. So, is there a risk that federal actions would impact how binding those goals would be, or that they would undermine any of those goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something that's still up in the air. So Hawaii set those goals, and I believe the original RPS was set in 2011, might be 2015. I could be a little bit off on those numbers. And there's now many states that have those standards. Hawaii was the first. And I think we don't really know what's going to happen with changes at the federal level. I think there's been some discussion of federal intervention in state goals like that. As far as I know, that hasn't happened yet in Hawaii, but definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen, and maybe I'm imagining it, but I feel like I've seen news that other states have been sued or something. I feel like I've seen something like that, but I don't. There's so much going on. I could have made it.
Yeah, I know there's in Michigan right now, they were trying to shut down a coal plant and it had to be shut down in the next year or two. And the federal government intervened and they're trying to prolong how long that coal plant is open. So I know there are instances of that, but I'm unaware of anything like that here.
Thanks for that. Any other burning questions before we move on? Okay, I don't see any. So, go ahead,
All right.
Eric.
Okay, so a little bit more background context. I think this is really good level setting when we talk about where we are in that progress to 2045. So this is renewable energy progress to date by island, and the percentage here on top of every bar is how much of that island's generation is currently renewable energy. And as you can see, Maui County is at 41%. So Maui County is counted as an entire county. It's not broken down by island. And then this dark red at the top is the amount of fossil fuels, and then everything else is a mix of different renewable energy from distributed photovoltaic, so that's rooftop solar, like what you would have on your home, to utility scale photovoltaic. So that would be like one of these huge solar farms, and then wind, hydroelectric, geothermal, biomass, and biofuels. So I think one really interesting thing about this graph is it really shows how much power each island uses. So you can see that Kauai Island is half, maybe even less than half of what Maui County uses. Um, Hawaii Island is somewhat similar to Maui County, I think slightly more. And then we can see that Oahu just uses way more power than any of the other islands, more than all of the other islands combined. And you can see the state totals here. So for Maui County, I know it's pretty small, but you can see that rooftop solar is making pretty big dent. It's a large portion of Maui County's produced power, but still a huge amount that's produced by fossil fuels here. And one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about Hawaii is that not only are we still very reliant on fossil fuels, but we are actually the only state that still is burning low sulfur fuel oil, which is like the dirtiest of dirty of fossil fuels out there. We have very old power plants. So as part of our work at the State Energy Office, we're actually able to track where all of our oil shipments come from and actually follow the ships. So this year, most of our oil is coming from Libya, which you can see here in the bottom right corner, right by Egypt. And these ships actually leave Libya, leave the Mediterranean, go south past Africa, South America. They no longer go through the Panama Canal because it's too busy, too much congestion, goes all the way around the southern tip of South America, and then comes all the way up to Hawaii. So this is a very long journey. And you can see how this oil is produced. So if you look at the scale here of this photo, this is half a mile across. In the top right photo, it's 4 miles, and just these huge plumes of where this oil is produced with very poor environmental standards, and then to be shipped literally around the world to get to Hawaii, where it's definitely not our best option. So here's to give you an idea of the efficiency of our generators. This bar graph is in order of decreasing generation. So the power plants on the left hand are producing the most. And you can see Ma'alaya on Maui is there as the fourth, and it is below the national average for US fossil fuel efficiency of generators. So it's not only that we're still dependent on fossil fuels, it's that they're very inefficient as well. Another negative side effect of this dependence on oil is that it really affects our prices. So really a large part of our utility bills is paying for this oil and fluctuations in that oil price. So you can see there's a lot going on in this graph, but these blue bars are the US national average price. And then you have the Hawaii price, which is the dark green line, and then the light green is the oil price. So you can see how closely our Hawaii electricity prices follow the price of oil globally. And then this shows it even better. So this is some data that our office puts out on Maui monthly bills. So this is a residential electric bill for 500 kilowatt hours, pretty normal electric bill. And then what portion of that bill is fixed cost and non-fuel costs. So essentially paying for the maintenance of the grid, electricity being provided, and then the dark blue on top is the portion of the bill spent on fuel and purchased power. So you can see it's like 50% of the bill, if not more. And when your electricity bill is going up, it's not that the fixed costs and the non-fuel costs are going up and down a whole lot. It's that that price of oil is going up and down a lot. So one of the big spikes here was actually when the war in Ukraine started. Oil became much more expensive around the world. And as a result, our electricity prices all the way here in Hawaii went up as well. All right, so finally to Maui. I want to talk a little bit about Maui's electric history. I think it's really fascinating. Did I see a
Eric,
question, Stacy?
before you move on to that, can you just explain for people what the difference is between utility scale and distributed PV? And then I had a follow-up question of if the batteries for those systems are also being tracked in that chart anywhere.
Yeah. So distributed PV or distributed solar is often known as rooftop solar, and this is the type of solar that you would have on your home that you see driving around in people's houses. They're generally, well, they are very, very small systems, and they're privately owned by the homeowner, or there could be some type of leasing arrangement with the solar company. Also importantly, rooftop solar, well, I won't get into that, but that's rooftop solar. And then utility scale solar, or PV, is like large solar farms. So this is when you would like be driving down the road and just see hundreds and hundreds of solar panels, and they're going to be selling large amounts of energy to the utility. And both home solar systems, rooftop solar and utility scale solar, both of those can have battery backup. So battery systems range from small enough to power your home for a few hours to small enough to contribute to shoring up the entire grid. Does that answer your question?
I was just curious if there was like a tracking of a difference between the PV that's just straight panels or which ones have that battery backup also, if it's anywhere in that chart or if it's being tracked at all, which ones have batteries and which don't.
Yeah, good question. So that's not included in this chart. But I know we do have some data on like the number of systems out there and which ones have batteries and which don't. So I can follow up on that.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks.
And actually, sorry, Stacy made me think of another question. I'm pretty sure the answer is no, but is there any data tracking when people are, I know like this happens a lot in Molokai and in East Maui, are just using gas generators for their power? Do we have any information on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. That's a great question. But I know like where I've been working with the community in Waianae, that's also very common, and still, yeah, very common here in Hawaii for people to have backup diesel or other types of generators.
So that means that, you know, if we were to actually reach our 100% goals for renewable, we probably wouldn't really have reached them if we don't know if people are using generators, right?
So the goal is based on electricity sold. Um, so it wouldn't include those generators. But yeah, if we're thinking about it from like a very holistic perspective, yeah, you're right that we'd be missing that if people are still using generators.
Thank you.
Eric, this is Ben speaking. Question on my side, does that slide account also for any off-grid solar, or that would be only what is connected to Hawaiian Electric?
So this
I think
graph is
one
going to
slide
be
back.
this one.
Two. Sorry, one more. All right. Sorry, the
Uh,
first one, that one.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, so this is going to only be solar that is utility scale and being sold to Hawaiian Electric, or yeah, rooftop solar that there's some agreement with Hawaiian Electric. So off-grid solar would not be counted in this.
Okay. Any idea of what proportion that could be, or?
I don't have any numbers with me. I believe it's a relatively low amount from our estimates of like, yeah, people who have solar that are completely disconnected from the grid or don't have any type of arrangement with the utility, but I don't have any numbers on me, no.
So do you know, Eric, if there's any efforts to look at those numbers? Because just to me, looking at what's going on with federal stuff, what's going on with, like, for example, on Maui with the power plants, and just sort of what the kind of the culture of our communities, where, you know, at some point people are going to be more and more just saying, I got to figure out my own thing. And then with, you know, add the PSPS to it, the power shutoffs. Are there any efforts to sort of track what sort of independent ways people are trying to make sure they don't end up with nothing at some point?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the focus right now is more on making sure that the grid is working. And I think a lot of that is because like the research does show that those who are able to go completely off grid through things like solar are normally the very affluent. Because you'd have to have like a really huge relatively large solar system on your house, plus a lot of batteries to have that 24-hour power. I think it's really a lot more than people realize. Even people with good sized systems on their homes and batteries um, that may provide, I don't know, even 90% of your day, but there's still that remaining 10, 15, 20% where you're going to want to be connected to the grid just in case you do need that power. Going completely off grid for electricity, I think is a bigger jump than a lot of people realize.
That makes sense.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is all right. So Maui's electric history. So one thing that I think that's really interesting about Maui is that Maui was actually the first island to have electricity. So many people talk about Iolani Palace having electricity before the White House. And that's true. Iolani Palace got electricity in, I believe it was 1888, 1887. But actually Sprecklesville Mill on Maui had electricity 6 years earlier in 1881. And then the first oil-fired power plant was built in 1907. About 14 years later, Maui Electric Company was established, but did not yet serve the entire island. So in 1933, they had this expansion into the Upcountry area. And then it wasn't until 1967 that Maui Electric Company became the island-wide utility provider. And Hana actually had its own utility company up to that point. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then in 1968, Maui Electric becomes part of Hawaiian Electric Company. And I don't think this is actually a power plant in this picture, but this is an old picture of Sprecklesville that I found online from, I believe it was like the early 1900s.
So how was that Sprecklesville mill powered if the first oil one wasn't until the 1900s?
I think it was most likely hydro, and I believe that's how Iolani Palace was actually originally powered as well.
Thanks.
Yep. And then this is how Maui is powered today. So every year, Hawaiian Electric has to release sustainability reports in these maps, and they provide an overview of every island and all of their energy resources. So these suns here are solar power generation sources. Some of them have batteries attached as well. So the value of a battery with a solar array is, I think the solar can power throughout the day while the sun's set. With that battery, it can last, often it's about 4 hours longer. So if you think the sun goes down at 7 p.m., let's say, with the battery, you can keep getting power from that until 11 p.m. or something like that. And actually, usually the electricity peak is sometime in the evening as everyone's getting home from work. You think you get home from work, power up your stove, start making dinner, turn on the TV, turn on the lights, and everyone's going home and doing the same thing. So it's really important to have batteries paired with the solar. And then a few things I wanted to point out are, one, this importance of Ma'alaya. So it is 212 megawatts. And if you start looking at the other megawatts here, nothing even comes close to that. So it is by far the largest power generator on the island of Maui and very important. And I'll come back to more on that in a few slides. So a little bit about the electric grid. And I believe there's also another presentation on this at the Hawaii Energy Conference that's publicly available. I think Stacy is going to share the link to that as well. But just some very basics. So the electric grid at its most basic involves generation, transmission, and distribution. So you're producing the energy or the electricity at some source. It could be fossil fuel, it could be renewable energy like wind or solar. So you've made it, and then you have to move it. So the voltage of it is actually stepped up, and this helps it travel better. And then it gets sent across transmission lines across long distances. We have relatively not a lot of this compared to the continental US, but especially if you spent time in the continental US, you can think of like these huge transmission lines that you see just taking electricity like hundreds and hundreds of miles. So it's sent through these transmission lines over long distances, and then that voltage that was stepped up for it to be transmitted has to be stepped down for it to be safe to go to your house. So you have a step down transformer, and then you have the distribution system. So that's when it's going through the wires and poles. These are the thin, smaller electric lines that you see, and then it's going into your home. And one really interesting thing about Hawaii is that each island has a separate grid. So none of the island grids are connected. They're all separate, and that makes things a lot more difficult in terms of making sure that reliable energy can be provided at all times versus the continental US, where multiple states use the same electric grid. So to use a real world example, let's say I'm in California and it's a really, really hot day and everyone's turning on their AC and there's this huge electricity demand. Well, I can go to Oregon or New Mexico and I can get some power from them and use that to help my grid. On Oahu or on Maui, if you need more power and there's not enough power on the grid, there's nowhere else to go. Everything that the grid needs has to be produced right there. So that makes things a bit more difficult here. It's also really important on a grid to provide both firm and intermittent energy. So firm energy are energy resources that can generate energy 24/7 and deliver on-demand power. We have some examples listed here, but this is essentially like these are the resources you have that you can turn on at any time, and they're always going to be there to provide power. They may take quite some time to turn on and get started up, but they're there versus intermittent energy, also called variable energy, which can change due to conditions outside of our control. So things like solar, if you have a cloudy, rainy day, or if the wind isn't blowing, or if you're relying on a river for hydropower and there's some issue with the river. So it's really important that we have a combination of both of these to make sure that we have a reliable, efficient grid. Here's a little bit on that, which I just discussed. And again, these slides will be made publicly available. So I mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize about the electricity grid in our energy system is who actually owns the grid. So we talked about generation and power being produced. And it used to be that utilities pretty much owned all of the power being produced. This really changed in the 1970s. There were some changes in the laws at the federal level, and it really opened up the market for other power producers. And today we call those independent power producers. So the vast majority of new projects in Hawaii and on Maui are not going to be owned by Hawaiian Electric. They're going to be owned by some developer, who's then going to sign a contract with Hawaiian Electric to sell them that energy. And this is also overseen by the Public Utilities Commission to make sure that those contracts are fair and benefit consumers. And those are known as power purchase agreements, or PPAs. The transmission and distribution parts of the electric grid are owned by Hawaiian Electric. So it's important to know. And then we also talked about self-generation. So things like rooftop solar that could be owned by individuals, businesses, or organizations. So two things that are coming up in the future for Maui that are very important are in just 2 years now, 2027, there's a plan to retire Kahului power plant. And this is one of the largest power plants on Maui. And then between 2028 and 2031, Ma'alea is going to be retired as well. And again, this is an absolutely huge power plant on Maui, the biggest by far. And you can see that these are very old power plants, with the first being built in 1954 and the second in 1971. So we have like 70, 50-year plus old power plants that aren't very efficient, but the grid is still very dependent on them. So this really underlines the need for new power generation. And there's a lot of ongoing projects. So this is the same map that I showed just a few slides ago. It includes a lot of these new projects that are in development right now. So these are projects that are supposed to be completed anytime between next year and 2027. The newest power project is the solar plus storage facility that was put into service in May of last year. And then you also have, so this approved by regulators means that agreement between the independent power producer and Hawaiian Electric has been approved. So once that's approved, construction can begin, and this project should be completed by 2026. And then in negotiations means that the developer and Hawaiian Electric are currently in negotiations over what that power purchasing agreement should look like, how much they pay for power, and all of the details that go into that. And then once it's negotiated, it goes to the Public Utilities Commission, who then approves it or makes some change to it or denies it. So you can see this is 6 projects. And most of those are included on this map. So these different asterisks after projects are the ones listed here. And then in terms of long-term planning, so Hawaiian Electric has to, I believe it's every 5 years right now, do something called an integrated grid plan, or an IGP. And that's when they have to do all of this modeling and studies to find out exactly what they think the needs for the grid are going to be in the future, going all the way up to 2045 and past. And then they have to create a plan of how they're going to meet all of those needs. And they update that every year as well. So this most recent plan just came out July 3rd, and it has all of the planned needs and stuff for Maui. And again, that's going to be updated and changed every year, but this is what it currently is. So as you can see, it involves a huge amount of wind and solar, pretty much 100 megawatts of wind and a little under 250 megawatts of solar to make up for all of that lost generation through those power plants closing, plus projected growth in electricity demand. All right, that was a lot. So any questions?
I have lots of questions, but if someone else has some, let them go first.
I wanted to give a second to see if any of our participants had questions. You can raise your hand if you're shy. But I know Shay and I have millions of questions between the two of us. So Shay, you can go first.
Okay. I'm gonna try to figure out how to do this. I'm just gonna kind of get to the overall thing. But I guess from my perspective, this is similar to my question before, but Well, there's a specific question about Ma'alaya and the parts, because my understanding is that in addition to it being retired, there's an issue with getting certain parts, so that power plant could fail potentially prior to the retirement. Is that true?
I know that there is an issue with the parts, and a lot of updates are available on that in publicly available Public Utility Commission submissions. I don't know kind of the extent of it, like if the, oh, looks like Walter has something to add. Do you want to come off mute, Walter?
All he said in the chat was that it was the 4 peaking generators and not the entire power plant. I assume he's talking
Okay.
about failing.
Yeah. So a plant that's as big as Ma'alaya or some of the bigger plants here on Oahu, like Kahe or Waiau, it's really interesting to visit these plants because it's not just like a single turbine. They'll have multiple turbines and parts of it, each of which are kind of like it's their own generating unit. So it sounds like the parts are for the peaking generators, not the entire plant. So it's not like this one part fails and all of that 200 megawatts is gone. It would be some section of the plant instead. So definitely cause for concern and something that I know our office is working on. The Public Utilities Commission discusses this a lot on Hawaiian Electric's mind, but also it's not like the entire 200 megawatts is going to be gone if something happens. I could hear you that time you came off mute, Walter. Do you want to add anything?
Sorry. Yeah, no, that was yeah, the 4 Mitsubishi peaking generators, each one was 12.5 megawatts, that they'll be retiring at some point because of the lack of components for that. The bulk of the energy production is from the dual train combined cycle combustion turbines that also use the waste heat recovery. A total of 4 22 megawatt combustion turbines, 2 of which are tied to an 18 megawatt steam turbine that takes the waste heat from the combustion turbines, basically the jet engine exhaust, and it makes another 18 megawatts of power there. Those are okay. It was the peaking units that were really the questionable, was the issue that came in out of the blue that caused a ruckus a few years back, but they seem to have a handle on that with more generation coming online, with more battery storage and things like that, it doesn't seem to be as critical or as big of an issue right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can tell that Walter is a scientist and I'm on the outreach team, but to provide a little bit more context on that, so even like these fossil fuel plants, there's different types. Some are they're very slow to start and they're meant to provide base load power. So it's just like a consistent amount of power. It's very slow to turn on or off. And then there's also these peaking plants or peaking generators, and those are meant to be able to, you can start it up really quickly, ramp it down really quickly if you need to. And that's dealing with if there's a sudden increase in demand, like, or if something happens, like suddenly it gets really cloudy out and there's not as much solar power and you need a lot of energy really quickly to keep the grid balanced, you would use something like that. And then the other thing that Walter mentioned is something, so it used to be power plants would have these huge turbines and you would have all of this heat created and it would just be wasted. And now these more efficient, newer power plants or even upgrades to old plants actually capture all of that excess heat that was wasted in the past and use it to create even more power. So they're much more efficient than they used to be. Thanks for chiming in there, Walter.
So Eric or Walter, if it sounds like the loss of power or the reduction in power maybe is 25, 50 megawatts worst case scenario, but it sounds like there's another issue because you just said balancing the grid. If these peaking generators start malfunctioning or can't be used, would that mean we might have some more power outages if the grid is harder to balance? Does that make sense, or?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think this is part of the appeal of batteries, is having that backup generation. So if you need to balance the grid quickly, you have those batteries backed up and ready to go.
We have a question from Scott. Does pump storage, I'm assuming he means hydro, have the peaking ability to respond quickly to changes in solar or wind in that similar
Yes,
way?
I believe so. Yeah, that's correct. Because so for those who are unfamiliar with pumped storage, you essentially have water at two different levels, and ideally you use renewable energy to pump water up to the higher level, and you release that water when you need it, and it's going to generate electricity. So hypothetically, yes, you'd be able to release that and quickly create power when needed.
I had kind of a different type of a question about the independent power producers. Did their agreement, and you might not even know the answer to this, but did their agreements with HECO prevent them from taking advantage of this new bill that was passed that allows them to distribute their own energy? I'm trying to see what the name of the bill was. I can't find it right now, but the one that still beats
The
and is HECO's
wheeling,
monopoly over. Yeah.
yeah.
And if the independent power producers, since much of our generation is kind of privately owned now, and they only have the contracts with HECO to deliver it, um, I know it's probably too soon to say what will happen, but is there any indication of how those relationships might change with that being signed into law?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it is still very early to answer that question. So essentially, currently, any electricity that is produced in Hawaii, like on a large scale, has to be sold to Hawaiian Electric, who then sells it to customers. And under new legislation, what is commonly called wheeling, uh, independent power producers could sell power directly to customers, um, or others without Hawaiian Electric as kind of this intermediary. And the rules for that and how that's going to play out are still very much being determined. So I don't think we know quite yet how that's going to look. Because of how the law was before, my assumption is that anyone building power in Hawaii would have wanted their contracts to only be selling it to Hawaiian Electric, because before they couldn't sell to anyone else. So you would have just written it where you sell as much as you can, all of it to Hawaiian Electric. That might, and I'm not sure how much they can change those contracts throughout like the life of it. Those are often like 20-year contracts. But we're coming up on some of those first 10, 20-year contracts coming up for renegotiation. And it'll be interesting to see, yeah, how wheeling affects that. I don't think we know yet.
Yeah, because I think one of the windmills was saying that they're
Mhm.
up for recertification or whatever the word is. So I'm just curious how that will affect those contracts.
Yeah, that's coming up soon on Maui in just a year or two, I think. So we'll see
I'm all
what
in for that.
happens.
Any other lingering? Oh, Alex has a question. Go ahead, Alex.
Hey, Stacy here, everyone. Not so much a question, but just to follow up on the retail wheeling law. Previous to the retail wheeling law being passed, there was a wheeling docket for local government or government wheeling, state and local government. The retail wheeling basically ended that docket, so that docket is now closed, and a new docket is going to be opened around retail wheeling. And so there are opportunities there for groups like yours and Line Energy Partnership and others to weigh in and provide input into what that will look like. I think, if I recall correctly, the retail wheeling law limits those to up to 2 megawatts in terms of size, which is not tiny, but it's also not as big as a 40 megawatt plant like the what's the one in Waiko Road over there? That Kuihilani? Is that the one? Kuihilani, the AES power plant. That's about 40 megawatts. And the retail wheeling will be allowed for 2 megawatts up per system. So a little smaller scale, but still able to, especially locally, be able to provide quite a bit. And on the retail wheeling, it's really, you're basically sending it into the grid. So you're sending it into HECO's transmission system, and then you can apply credits to some other user anywhere on the grid. So it really frees up. You don't have to actually connect the electrons from the generation to the user. It just allows you to get it onto the grid and then sell it to another user. So just wanted to share that.
Like a big pot.
Yeah, like a big pot. And now
Selling credits.
there can be a bunch of new players on there, and HECO has to make their transmission and distribution system available to that as part of that law.
So that's, thank you, Alex. Actually, that gives us a chance to just plug our next webinar next month, which is going to be PUC 201. We did a PUC 101 a few months ago, and the idea is to talk more about how communities can, because we really confusing and complicated. So that'll give us another example of a docket for people to get involved in. So thanks, Alex. And then I have some more questions if other people don't have questions.
Eric, did you have more of your PowerPoint to share, or?
Yeah, so I have my final section, which is on Upcountry, but I have let me count. I've got about 6 more slides.
I can
Do we want
hold my questions. Want to do that?
Okay. Yeah, let's finish the PowerPoint and then we can have more time for questions afterwards.
Great. All right, so now finally to Upcountry. And so I've been learning a lot more about Upcountry in the last few months, working with the Upcountry Energy Resiliency Project, and it's really been exciting to learn more about the community, and I'm really thankful for everyone's time and effort that they're putting into energy planning. But so one of the things that we do through ETIPP is identify community strengths and challenges. So I just wanted to go over those quickly. Some of the strengths that Upcountry has that I think make it really unique are really strong community ties, people working together, a deep cultural identity, and then this interest in engaging in energy planning. So I know it's easy to look at communities who have been doing energy planning for quite some time and think, oh, we haven't done much. But when you think of all of Hawaii's communities or all of the US's communities, Upcountry is really ahead of the curve and already thinking about energy and energy planning, where our power comes from, how it's produced, how we use it. But also Upcountry faces unique challenges as well. So fire risk, as we know from previous fires, flooding, and then there's access to clean energy, but it's not equal. So Upcountry is a community where you have quite a range of income distribution, and some people have really great solar on their houses and have had it for quite some time and received a lot of benefits from that. And then you have others who are renters and don't have those types of opportunities. There's also a lot of potential, potentially host projects in the future. And Hawaiian Electric actually looks at renewable energy zones, places in the state that they think have potential to host projects from a technical perspective, looking at things like the grid and capacity, and parts of that overlap with Upcountry. So I know a topic that's really important in Upcountry is Hawaiian Electric's new public safety power shutoffs. So I want to talk about those real quick. So these were created as an official utility program in response to the Lahaina wildfire and how to make sure that something like that can never happen again. And it's part of Hawaiian Electric's wildfire prevention plan. I forgot prevention in that second bullet there. But I want to note that this wildfire prevention plan is still under review at the Public Utilities Commission. So it hasn't been finalized yet. They're still figuring out the details. It's a work in progress. But this map here shows the PSPS estimated outage areas across Maui County. And essentially, at its most basic, what PSPS is when the utility is worried that there's a high probability of a fire, shutting off the power preemptively to prevent any type of downed power line starting a fire. And I think the important thing to remember is what triggers public safety power shutoff. So when is the power actually going to be turned off? And that's by sustained wind gusts of over 45 miles per hour, plus relative humidity of 45% or lower. And if weather conditions get close to either of these things, Hawaiian Electric goes into like alert mode and starts monitoring these and figuring out if they're going to have to shut the power off or not. And I was actually able to attend a Hawaiian Electric exercise that they did on public safety power shutoffs. So it was representatives from Hawaiian Electric, from the fire department, the police department, from state government, from local government, and all of them talking about what they would do if they actually did have to implement public safety power shutoffs. And it was interesting to learn a lot about the challenges. So the challenge of balancing power supply and safety. We know that when the power gets turned off, it has a huge effect on not only convenience, but things like people's health, businesses, and their inventory. That it makes a huge impact on people's lives. This isn't something to be taken lightly, but at the same time, trying to avoid another wildfire and how to balance those two things. Other challenges are sustained bad weather and what happens when you have wind gusts that are over 45 and then they're going down for a little bit, then going back up, the humidity's changing, and when to know to make that decision. And then when I went to that exercise on public safety power shutoffs, what was most interesting to me was actually not about turning the power off, but turning the power back on, which is also a huge consideration. And one thing I learned was that with these new public safety power shutoffs, to turn the power back on, all of the equipment has to be inspected, either by person or by drone. So this becomes really important because many of these areas are very hard to reach. And what happens when you get close to nighttime and it's suddenly dark outside, and it becomes even more difficult to inspect these areas. So actually quite recently, Upcountry experienced the first public safety power shutoffs for all of Hawaiian Electric's territory as far as I know, and 330 customers went without power overnight. And from my understanding from Hawaiian Electric's public statements that they put out, a large part of this was that they were unable to complete the inspection before nightfall. So they had to wait until the morning to make sure all of those lines were okay. There were no fallen lines or anything like that. And then they were able to turn the power back on. Another thing that gets mentioned frequently in the context of fire protection and upcountry is undergrounding of power lines. I want to talk a little bit about that because it's something we discuss in our office and pros and cons of that. And I know the pros get focused on, but there are also some drawbacks. So the big pro is reliability. If the power lines are underground, they can't be knocked over by the wind. That's a huge benefit. Also, no one likes to see power lines. So aesthetically, it's a lot nicer to have those power lines underground. But there are also some drawbacks. So while underground lines are better for things like wind, there are issues with flooding, especially if they're in areas that can get really wet. That can be a challenge with underground lines. Construction as well. So you're essentially digging large trenches or ditches to lay these lines underground, which also means that fixing issues is more difficult. So you can just imagine, even on a small scale, fixing something that's hanging up on a line versus fixing something that you have to dig up every time you fix it. And the same with upgrades. So upgrades on hanging lines are relatively easy versus underground lines, where every upgrade, you're essentially going through all the work that you did to construct the line. And all of these things lead to those underground lines costing approximately 5 to 10 times more than overhead lines. And this is even more complicated in Hawaii versus the continental US, just because we are living on old volcanoes and have very hard ground to work with, and also very remote areas. All right, so talking about some solutions for energy resilience in Upcountry, two that we've been talking about a lot, the Upcountry Energy Resiliency Project, are microgrids and resilience hubs. And microgrids are becoming increasingly popular throughout the US and the world. And the term is used really broadly. But essentially, a microgrid is a group of interconnected loads and distributed energy resources. And loads here means energy needs. So that could be houses, businesses, stuff like that. And then distributed energy resources are some source of energy production. And what makes a microgrid unique is that it can connect and disconnect from the grid. So it can be part of this larger grid, or it can operate in island mode. But very importantly, to be in island mode, you have to have some way to produce energy. So that's kind of the hard part of it. So of course, these can improve customer reliability and resilience to grid disturbances. And these can be very useful. Historically, there has not been many microgrids created in Hawaii, few if any, and that's in large part because of the regulatory and policy context. There isn't a clear pathway for developers to develop profitable microgrids. So there hasn't been a lot of development of them, but it's something that a lot of communities are looking into further. But again, I would just emphasize that there has to be something powering them. So a lot of microgrids will have solar, battery, something like that, but they also often have some type of fossil fuel backup as well to complement that. And then related to that are resilience hubs. And sometimes resilience hubs and microgrids can be paired together. But resilience hubs are a collection of services and resources that support communities before, during, or after a disaster or disruptive event. So here we're talking about them in the context of energy and electricity, but they're much broader. So resilience hubs are really geared towards helping communities in all aspects. So shelter, fresh water, food, even medical services as a hub for emergency responders and other supplies needed in an emergency situation. And a lot of resilience hubs are placed in existing community buildings and can be like community centers during non-emergency situations. So one thing that we've been looking into, actually before that, here's an example of a resilience hub from Serene, Hawaii, which is based here on Oahu. They've been doing a lot of work on resilience hubs here, but an example of what some different things that a resilience hub could include. Everything from an energy source and a charging station to emergency first aid, access to water and essential needs, a community garden, some type of communication for an emergency. But yeah, so we're continuing to look into resilience hubs for Upcountry Maui. And we're working with a national lab tech team to do that, and looking at an analysis of ideal locations for resilience hubs and microgrids. both from a technical perspective, from where it would make the most sense on the grid, but also from a community perspective. So where it would make the most sense for everyday community members of Upcountry. And we'll be continuing community engagement and education. And again, please reach out to me if you have any questions, comments, concerns. Always happy to chat further and to help out however I can. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Eric. I wanted to open up the floor again and see if anyone who's on the call currently has any questions now that we hit the end of the presentation. But you're welcome to still use the chat and I can read them off if you're shy. I had a quick question about microgrids, kind of in the same context of my question before about wheeling, and just thinking about different scenarios, like if say an HOA community wanted to create a microgrid of their just from their HOA group, would that be something that meets that definition and is like a something that's possible since they're already kind of a entity of their own?
Yeah, so the question was if an HOA would be able to create a microgrid and how wheeling affects that.
Yeah, if they'd be allowed to, like, say, use the existing solar, like the rooftop solar of your neighbors to power like the whole community rather than just your own individual house.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not sure with the new wheeling legislation how that would work, but I think that's a good example of how wheeling in a microgrid could hypothetically work. Because yeah, you would be selling electricity to your neighbors and your HOA instead of to the utility. So I don't know for the specifics of here in Hawaii in the new law if that would be possible. But that is an example of what it could look like. Yeah,
But before the law would be not allowed. And now it's like
correct.
maybe.
Yep.
Okay.
Alex, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. And sorry, I'm in cooking mode here. I got stuff on the stove, so don't have video on. But with with microgrids, there was a microgrid tariff docket at the PUC that was open for several years. It closed with no firm conclusions of a pathway forward for making the whole intent was how to make microgrids financially viable. And that would be to come up with a tariff where if you developed a microgrid, you could get some type of compensation for exporting back to the grid during blue sky days while having that resiliency and backup for whatever it is you're trying to power during emergency times. So that's been the main obstacle for microgrids being developed. The best examples of microgrids to date that are somewhat financially viable would be campuses. Something like Maui College would have a microgrid, but in terms of but it's all within its own perimeter. It has maybe some export, and it's all under its own meter. It's not using the HECO transmission lines or distribution lines to get it to other users. And that's where it becomes tricky, because when you're with an HOA, you have multiple HECO accounts for each homeowner. And if you're transmitting or distributing power between them, now you become a utility, and you're regulated as a utility, which comes with a bunch of responsibilities and costs. And so that's what we need to work around, is figuring out a way where, because a lot of people are interested in neighborhood scale microgrids, right? And that's something we have to figure out, where you don't end up being regulated like a utility. You can make it financially viable somehow. Yeah, blue sky being non-emergency days. Thanks, Eric. And one possible opportunity, I mentioned the opportunity to weigh in on the upcoming wheeling docket that would be reopened, or like a new docket would be open on this retail wheeling. Another opportunity would be in weighing in on the IGP implementation. And all of the procurement for utility scale renewables is done under IGP. And there's an opportunity to weigh in and say, hey, we'd like, for future procurements, we would like to see microgrids, community scale microgrids that could be part of HECO procurements potentially. But HECO would have to have that directive to say, put out an RFP for neighborhood scale microgrids. That could be one way to create some of those and have them be financially viable and kind of work around the being regulated as a utility issue. So that's another opportunity to look out for, is getting involved in the IGP docket around implementation of IGP.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Shay has her hand up. Before we get too deep though, I do want to plug a couple things because I know some people will probably start to leave. The Lahaina Energy Project, which is not an ETIPP project, but it's kind of like related because they're also run by NREL, just released their report. So if anyone's interested in diving deeper into this, they have a great example of kind of what we're attempting to do on a smaller scale. And the Molokai CRAP report, CER, type it in here, is another good example of other like community style energy projects. The Lahaina project is having their next co-design workshop next week, Thursday. If anyone lives on that side and wants to participate in that. And if you're not already on my email list or like registered for this event and want to hear about our next webinar that Shane mentioned about PUC 201, where we'll talk more about like intervention or how to even engage with any of these dockets we've listed. I will send out an email announcement and post in all the other places that I've did this one when that gets scheduled to go more and dive deeper into the PUC and a lot of these dockets that we've been talking about. And then I will let Shay ask her question now.
Thank you, Stacey. Thanks for the announcements. Actually, I just wanted to mention, if I'm not mistaken, there is also a microgrid docket that has been reopened. Isn't that correct, Eric?
I believe you might be referring to, I think there's a new resilience hub docket.
Right. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I also had a question about microgrids, and I guess part of my question is, so if there had been a microgrid upcountry or in Ulapalakua, I think that's where the PSPS mostly was. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But is there any way a microgrid could have been employed to reduce the amount of the shutoff? Because it still has to go on the same lines, right? I mean, I guess that's my question.
I think it depends on the size and location of the microgrid. So yeah, if the microgrid had above ground lines that were still in that area where you would want to turn the power off, it wouldn't have helped. But if the microgrid was small, was underground, it could potentially have kept the power on during that. So I think it really depends on size, location, and what the lines are like.
Cool, thank you. And then going back to that PSPS for a second, and I know this is not something you have control over per se, but going back to sort of the energy landscape, and maybe this is where the consumer advocate would get involved, but in that article that Stacy posted, there were a lot of different people who talked about what was, all the cost, right? If somebody's freezer, I think it was Surf and Goat Dairy, lost a whole bunch of product, various farmers, and one of the issues was communication. It sounds like, I mean, what you said about the overnight reasons, I didn't see that mentioned in the article, and maybe I skimmed it too fast, but I think people would have, I do remember reading something where somebody said, if I had known it was going to be off overnight, I would have done something different and perhaps could have saved some of this product. And I think that was a key issue, was communication by HECO to the community. And we have had a few different things where we've suggested to HECO that they could do things in a way that works better for customers, and they're not super responsive. And it's like, do we have to go intervene in a docket? Because you mentioned the PSPS docket being open, or is there another way? Because just telling them that, hey, if you spell out the acronym on the bill, that would make people's lives a lot easier. They don't really like to do that. And they shouldn't just do what Shay and Stacy think, but at the same time, there are things that it would be helpful if there was an easier way besides intervening in a docket to get them to do things that are not that difficult, I don't think, that could make people's lives a little bit.
Yeah, good question. Those are definitely two routes to work with them or pressure them to do things. I think you kind of hit the two ends of the spectrum of like informal feedback versus formal intervention in a public utilities commission docket is probably the most formal and official way.
Well, I
Yeah,
guess
I think those are the two
wondering,
ends of the spectrum.
yeah, I was just wondering if there's a third way, since, it seems like a lot to have to like intervene in the PSPS docket if it's even a possibility, right, to be an intervener, just to say, hey, it would be great if they communicated better about what was going on, right?
Mhm. I know they do occasionally have specific areas on their website where you can um, provide feedback for. So for like the integrated grid planning, you could leave specific comments on integrated grid planning. I don't know if they have something like that for PSPS. Um, at least then it's going on record instead of just being said at a public meeting, but I can look into that. And then also, as Walter mentioned, there is the consumer advocate that you could reach out to. Michael Angelo is the current consumer advocate, and they are tasked with representing all consumers in Public Utility Commission proceedings.
Well, and actually, and he's very, we've talked to him before, and he's great. And he was on one of our webinars. And I guess again, it shouldn't just because Shay thinks so, right? It would be nice if the consumer advocate or some entity like that actually surveyed the people who just experienced the PSPS and said, what would be helpful? Because I understand that, there's these limitations, and of course, HECO's trying to keep people safe, but sometimes there's just more than one way to do things, and the people in the community often have, and I wasn't affected, I'm not Upcountry, right? But people in the community often have the best ideas, right? There could be some very simple ideas that nobody thought of that would make people's lives just that much easier.
I was also wondering if the solutions that we discussed today, I know there's other options, if microgrids or resilience hubs, kind of rephrasing, I guess, Shay's questions and comments, if those could be potential ways to avoid a PSPS, does that actually make the grid? Do those two solutions actually make the grid safer, or is this more like a harm mitigation strategy by investing in these resilience hubs and microgrids? Like, does it actually prevent a PSPS from happening, or is it more so from a safety perspective that those are solutions?
I think it is more so from a safety perspective and is harm mitigation. Um, yeah, Alex, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to add something?
I was just gonna add something different, but just on that note, it depends how the microgrid or resilience hub is set up. If it's behind the meter or front of the meter, basically, is it part of HECO's grid, or is it just site-based, let's say at UHMC? If there's hypothetically, if Kahului had PSPS, which I don't think it does, but let's say they triggered a PSPS in Kahului, UHMC could keep the lights on by using its own battery system and everything on its side of the meter. but they wouldn't be getting HECO power and they couldn't export, right? So it depends how the resilience hub or microgrid is set up. But I had a separate point, which I forget now. So I'm going to go back on mute. If it comes back, I'll raise my hand again.
Okay, and then we have a question in the chat that I will rephrase a little bit. Sorry, Kaniela. But I think the question is more getting to like energy as a public trust resource, and if there's any initiatives from and any of the entities we discussed at the beginning of the meeting or the state energy office to acknowledge the that issue of charging people for what some believe is a public trust resource.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for raising that. So I'll bring up a couple things that are going on. The Public Utilities Commission in 2022 opened up an equity docket, and that equity docket does consider the history of Hawaii and our unique situation here. Also, my office, the Hawaii State Energy Office, through our Energize Kako work, has done a lot of work on the history of electricity in Hawaii and talking about issues like this. And then also in terms of public trust resources, I know this is something that gets talked a lot about with the development of future energy resources. So if there was development of more geothermal power in Hawaii, that would be a public trust resource. And what would that look like compared to other energy resources?
And the question asker is not a fan of geothermal. So I think that there's a conflict there of like the question from royal ceded land perspectives and the solution being geothermal are directly at odds with each other. But we're not talking about geothermal today. I do also want to mention Cheryl's suggestion of how Spectrum, when they have outages and they send out ETAs, and that like HECO should maybe adopt some of those communication practices that Spectrum has, even though it's not perfect. And then Alex also has his hand up.
Okay, thanks. I remembered what I was going to share earlier. I was just going to share that these efforts that are underway, like the Upcountry Energy Planning effort and the Lahaina Energy Partnership and other communities across the state that are undertaking these community-led planning efforts, we had a conversation with the PUC recently, just suggesting there should be a way for those plans to be more easily integrated into IGP or similar grid planning efforts without, like Shay was saying, without necessarily having to intervene in the docket, or, maybe you're just submitting testimony, but it's like, here's our testimony, here's our 100-page plan, and we've gone through all this community work, and this is what this community wants. And then that should be integrated into IGP. So just something to keep in mind if folks think it's a good idea to advocate for a pathway for that to happen without, just we come up with community energy plans and then HECO has a separate plan that it develops, and then that's what ends up getting adopted by the PUC, right? Unless you intervene and go like step by step through the docket and try to provide input along the way. So hopefully there's a way for these community energy planning efforts to be more easily integrated and recognized.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. And I do really want to emphasize like how new this is that communities are planning for their energy needs on their own, and this interaction between high-level energy planning from utilities and the state communities and trying to figure out how to fit those two together is a relatively new thing, and how important this work is.
And that kind of sparks a question for me about because of the Hawaii State Energy Office being like the regional partner in a lot of these community planning projects, and your introduction at the beginning, it's the first time I've heard you describe HSEO as like the coach. And so just wondering what, if even, the state energy office has plans to like integrate these community energy initiatives into kind of the whole Hawaii State Energy Office, and the way that you coach that field of many players.
Yeah, so I should clarify we're the coach in terms of trying to make everyone work together well,
Yeah.
in that sense. Still working on that analogy. But yeah, I think
I
so. I
like
think
it.
we're like always my colleague Parker is on the line and my colleague Ben, and we're always working on trying to figure out ways to integrate community feedback. So one way we do that is through our Wayfinders program, which Ben is a part of. So we have a Wayfinder on each island who works closely with communities to get a sense of like what are things like on the ground, not like in an office building downtown. Um, and we're also working to create all of these community-based organization partnerships on all of the different islands. So that's one way that we're trying to do that as well. So yeah, this is something we're working on all the time, and yeah, trying to figure out how to get that community feedback and to integrate it into everything that we do.
Appreciate that and all of your help, since you kind of officially began helping us with this project. I want to leave oh, Shay still has. Yeah,
Sorry,
say.
I'll be quick.
No, I was reading the chat. Sorry. Go ahead, Shay.
Okay. So the other thing that, and I kind of talked about this earlier, but the whole federal issue, and you know, we totally appreciate your help, Eric, and we appreciate HSEO's, interest in supporting community. But I sort of feel like I get frustrated with the idea of like, oh, there's all this stuff going on, but we might let community, have a say, or we might listen to them, and it's sort of optional for us, blah, blah, blah. Not that you're saying that, Eric, but just kind of the general feel of it. While at the same time, like when I looked at when you were showing your list of, the Maʻalai power plant and the different, the Kahului getting retired, and then the upcoming wind and solar projects, from what I've been seeing, there's a lot of different kinds of risks in the general plan, right? That's going on right now. There's the risk of, when you mentioned that coal plant in Michigan, I think we talked to somebody who gave us some firsthand sort of information about that. I think it was the same plant, but where nobody wanted that to continue. Like, it is not a good thing, not just because it's coal, but because the plant is just like, should not be run. It's not safe. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. They were all ready to shut it down, and Trump said, no, we're going to keep it open, right? And so how do we know he's not going to say the same thing about Kahului Maʻalaia, regardless of the fact that they really shouldn't be run any longer? And then on the other side of it, all these wind and solar projects with, the federal, whatever federal money people were thinking they were going to help pay for some of these different projects, or on top of that, the various tariffs, et cetera. It seems a little crazy to me, because that chart that you showed, I feel like I've seen that same chart for a while now. I mean, it gets updated, it gets changed a little bit, but are we all living in like this fantasy where we're saying, oh, this is the reality of Hawaii's energy landscape, at least as long as the White House is the way it is, right? And then kind of going, oh, community, that's cool, we might listen, when in fact it may be on us. It may be ultimately like, if you didn't figure out how to power your house, 5 years from now on your own, you're in trouble. And I don't mean to be doomsday. I'm just saying, I feel like there needs to be a little bit more of a reality check of what we're going through, as far as saying, this is our plan, but these are the things that could go wrong. And we just saw something go wrong last week over here in Michigan or somewhere else. Anyway, I don't really want to end on that note, but I was going to say it earlier.
Yeah. Um, Well, I think Hawaii has done really important work around energy through different administrations. The RPS was started in 2011. We've had different administrations since then, and I think we have a state government that's really committed to sticking to the path on that. One thing I forgot to even mention was that there was a recent executive order from Governor Green that actually increased or moved up the renewable portfolio standard for all of the islands other than Oahu up to 2035. So the goal is now to have Maui County, Hawaii Island, um, Kauai all to 100% renewable energy by 2035. So I think at least at the state level, there isn't a retreat at all from that. If anything, there's like a doubling down, and everyone's really putting their full effort into that.
That's good to hear. That's good. And again, I mean, I could be completely reading the tea leaves wrong, right? But I'm just it seems to me that it's just good to acknowledge those kinds of things because we all are reading the news, right?
Mhm.
Multiple sources.
I think it's also just another reminder of how important it is to not only be self-sustaining as like a home or like an individual, but like the community sustaining that level of self-sustainability. And it's really inspiring that when you show that chart of all of the national ETIPP projects, how many are in Hawaii, both currently and in the past, because it shows that like our state, our communities are understand the importance of this and like engaging in the process, even though it is really confusing sometimes and really technical sometimes. So I just wanted to I'll pivot that kind of the scary side of this because that is real, but just to reiterate how important it is for us to continue to show up to these things and like have these difficult conversations and ask the difficult questions that Eric has very been really good at answering as best as you can. So I really want to appreciate you and mahalo you again, Eric, for preparing this PowerPoint and guest presenting for our group and all that you do to support community, leading these conversations and being kind of like the middleman for us in these rooms that we're not in. So yeah, I really appreciate that. We can end on that note if nobody else has other questions. You have Eric's email, you have my email, hopefully. And if you want to be on our email list, you can just register for this event, even though it's past. And then when the recordings and all the documents are ready, I'm going to send it out to everyone who registered, because those are the only emails I have. So on that, I will end the recording.